Welcome to Minerva Meets. I'm your host, Sonal Chandler, and this is episode 18. Today is also a fun milestone because it's our very first video format. So if you're watching or if you're listening, thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited to continue doing these more on video. So today we're actually going to be exploring Microsoft 365 Copilot. What is it, what it's not, and what your business can do to really take advantage of it and roll it out in your organization. So as some of you may know already, Copilot is built on the Microsoft tools that we actually use every day, like Word, Excel, Outlook. But just because it's available, it doesn't necessarily mean that every organization can just automatically turn it on and be ready for it. So, if you're really wondering about, what Copilot can do or how to get it into your organization, how to take advantage of it, then this episode is for you. And to help me break us all down, I've invited Mike Wilson to the show today. So, Mike, thank you so much for being here. Mike is actually Chief Technology Officer at a company called Interlink, which is a nationally recognized IT consulting firm. So, Mike, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's a huge honor to be here, especially for the milestone broadcast to be in the first time on video, although I think you should probably pick somebody a little bit more photogenic for that one. But no, super happy to be here. Love talking about it. I definitely describe myself. If you look at me on LinkedIn, you'll see me as a Microsoft evangelist. It's a huge part of what we do and what I've done from a career standpoint. So I think when you get to the title of Chief Technology Officer, it mainly means that you've just been around a long time. But I think we both came of age within IT at similar times, and so you had an
Yeah.
opportunity to do a lot of different things. So I've done networking, I've done server administration, I've done development, I've done security, I've done IT leadership, and so I've done a little bit of all that stuff. And so I've seen a lot of change over the course of the industry, starting with dial-up internet. And so what's interesting about AI is that it really took us years to go through and have internet really make a big change in terms of the economy, right? And how
Right.
organizations could go through and harness that connectivity to change the way that they do business. The amazing thing about artificial intelligence and Copilot in particular is just how rapid the adoption. Okay, because
Yes. Yeah.
OpenAI with ChatGPT saw the fastest adoption of essentially any application, right, in the
Yeah.
history of applications, which is pretty amazing. So with Copilot in particular, what we're talking about here is really Microsoft's implementation of OpenAI's foundational models, ChatGPT, within the Microsoft 365 applications and with access to your data. Now,
Yes.
the challenge that we have with Copilot is that, like Microsoft, and this is, I think, one of the things that we struggle with them as an organization, is that Microsoft is great at developing awesome products. Sometimes they're terrible at branding, right? So when we talk
Yeah.
about Copilot, there's a lot of Copilots, right? And so we've got to make sure that we go through and kind of define what it is that we're actually looking at.
Yeah.
Right? So Copilot could mean Copilot for security, which is embedded inside of the Defender tools. It could mean Copilot for the Power Platform. It could be Copilot for Dynamics, right? But really what we're talking about today is Copilot for Microsoft 365, right? And
Mhm.
so this is embedded in the Office applications, like you mentioned. So the ability to use generative AI inside of Outlook, inside of Teams, inside of Word, inside of Excel, inside of PowerPoint. And then also the ability to go through and use Copilot chat to research the internet. And we can do all of this with access to our data. So what we're talking about is that ability to go through and really have game-changing experiences from an end user perspective, right? So never having to go through and start from scratch on a document. As long as you have a vision for what it is that you're working on, you've got a generative AI assistant who can help you go through and generate that content, or at least take a first pass at it. I know
Yeah.
for me, I've got that technical brain, so I'm probably not the most creative, right? So as long as I can go through and outline what it is I want to accomplish, maybe I just go through and literally create an outline in Word. Okay, with a couple of clicks, I can have Copilot go through and create a PowerPoint presentation complete with AI generated graphics that are related to the content, okay, in a matter of seconds. So for me, that's a huge advantage in terms of my ability to go through and augment something that I'm good at, which is clubbing you over the head with content, and turning into something that is a lot more visually pleasing.
Okay, so there's a lot there. So let's pause and say, okay, so the AI that we're talking about today is the one that's embedded. It's like you said, Microsoft's version of OpenAI, or I guess you said it very well. You said Microsoft's implementation of OpenAI.
Yeah, Microsoft
And
has invested in OpenAI significantly and has implemented their models. So even though, I mean, it's essentially the same models that are being run by OpenAI, these are run in Microsoft data centers with a
Mhm.
different level of security around it. So none of the content that we're putting inside of the Microsoft Copilot tools is being used to go back and train OpenAI's models to make them better. So you don't
Yeah.
have to worry about that data leakage.
Yeah, and that's key because I get a lot of questions when I'm doing AI consulting work about data privacy and, oh, is my data going to be going out and being, to leverage to train the models? So I think that's a really key thing to point out and to highlight. But you can actually leverage it to use any data that you give it access to within your own organization. Is
Yeah,
that
that's the
the
part.
right way to say it?
I think so. And that's the part that I think really makes it kind of unique within the AI space, right? In terms of the number of tools that we've seen.
Hmm.
One of the challenges that I think a lot of organizations are trying to struggle with or are struggling with in the AI space is how do I go through and pick the right tools for my business?
Right,
Right. So I've
right.
got concerns around security, I've got concerns around data privacy, but I also have concerns around how do I pick the right tool for the job? Do I want to take something that's a little bit more general purpose, like ChatGPT or Claude or Grok or
Mhm.
Copilot, obviously, which is what we're talking about today? Or do I want to go through and look at tools that are very fit for specific purposes? So
Mm,
there's pros and
yeah.
cons to different options there. There's different levels of security, but I think Microsoft has built a very nice niche in this space with a tool that is very capable, right? But
Mhm.
it is more general purpose with the Copilot for M365, but it's unique in that it has access to your data on M365. So if you're already using Microsoft 365 today, and let's be clear, that's most organizations in the
Right,
United
right.
States at this point.
Yeah.
You've got data stored in SharePoint. You've got data stored in Teams. You've got your email content inside of Outlook, right? And so
Mhm.
Copilot has access to that content, and it does that in a secure way. Now, we
Okay.
can also go through and compare that to, say, ChatGPT Enterprise. ChatGPT Enterprise is another paid service where,
Mhm.
again, I can go through and work with it. My data is secure. It's not used to train the models. I think that's common across both of those scenarios. But ChatGPT Enterprise doesn't have access to your data on M365.
Right.
That's the difference. So even though we have opportunities to go through and make sure that we're at least kind of keeping data within our security perimeter, with Copilot, we can go through and really leverage that access to the data, which again, most of the time, if we're creating a presentation, for example, no, I'll relate it to our industry because we're both in consulting. If
Mhm.
I want to go through and create a presentation to present a statement of work back to a customer, I've already got the foundational document. I've
Yeah.
written the Word document, it's laid out. Okay. And so that ability to go through and say, hey, create a presentation from this existing document is incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's
I mean, the time you save, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've sat and tried to think about, okay, what do I want to say? Even though I've done this a million times, right? So that's just advantageous to get you, there quicker, right?
Yeah, no, completely. And so we see like, a lot of, I mean, not every role in the organization is going to go through and benefit from having an AI assistant like Copilot, right?
Yeah.
But you definitely see the people that are in the more creative professions. So if you're
Mhm.
in marketing, we see huge advantages in terms of the ability to generate content. And so sometimes it's I want to go through and leverage my existing content and then iterate
Yeah.
on it to make it better. In other cases, I may need to go through and create something for, say a new product that we're going to go launch, or I'm going to want to go through and do research on the internet. I found that now that I have access to Copilot, I'm not searching anymore the way that I used to. Right.
Mhm.
So it's a
Yeah.
lot better for me to go through and use Copilot to do the foundational research on what it is. And then if I want to iterate from that into a document, or if I want to summarize that in an email that I can send to somebody else in my team, right, I can go through and do that quickly and easily. And what's
Yeah.
interesting about that, if we go back to the security thing for just a second, is that Google's foundational business is tracking what you do on the internet and finding a way to serve ads to you, knowing
Yeah.
lots and lots of things about you. Right. Well, when I use a tool like Copilot, I'm no longer doing search. I'm not using Google
Yeah.
any longer.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, Microsoft's not out there trying to monetize that knowledge around me. Right.
Right.
Whatever I go do research on in Copilot stays within the security perimeter of my organization, which is pretty awesome.
Mhm. Yeah, that's amazing. So let's kind of pivot and talk a little bit about how do we get to that point, right? Because there's this implementation and setup and tagging or marking. Like, let's talk a little bit about the different areas that we really have to think about when we're doing an implementation for Copilot.
I'm sure Microsoft would love for you to just go through and buy your $30 a user a month license for Copilot and
Yeah.
just go turn it on for everybody. But I think we all understand that there's some prep work that we want to do in order to make sure that we're really maximizing the value of Copilot and
Mhm.
ultimately implementing it from a security standpoint. So we really look at things kind of along two tracks. One of those is around kind of the human side of change, right? What
Mhm.
roles within the organization are going to benefit most? What are the use cases that map to them very specifically? And so we want to make sure that we're taking the time to go through, train them on how to go through and use the tool. And I will tell you, one of the things that we figured out is there's an art to prompting. Okay. The more
Yes. Yes.
specific you are in terms of telling Copilot what you want, the better result that you're going to get back. Right.
Mhm.
So being able to describe, here's what I want, here's how I want you to do it, and then here's the format that I want it to come back to me in is incredibly powerful, but that's not intuitive, right?
Yeah.
We're used to, even if you analogize to working with a human assistant, generally, they know you, they've seen you, right? There's a lot of information that is not conveyed when you make a request to a human assistant. That's
Yeah.
just assumed in the process. Copilot's not like that. All right. The more specific you are, the better results you're going to have back. So we want to make sure that we kind of prepare for that human side of change, right? To make sure that
Mhm.
we're going down that path. And again, I'll make fun of myself here for just a second, right? But Copilot has two modes, a work mode and a web mode, right? The web
Mhm.
mode is going to be for your more general research, right? I'm trying to go through and search for something on the internet. And so I'm going to use Copilot instead and have that better experience to go through and
Mhm.
summarize the data back to me. Copilot for work is intended to go through and work with the data inside of my organization. And it's a toggle you have to pick back and forth.
Okay.
Doing general purpose research on Copilot for work is not very good,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
But doing it for the web is fantastic. And so
Okay.
I was complaining to my practice manager kind of in this area.
Mhm.
I was still using ChatGPT more frequently, and so they were kind
Sure.
of joking that they're going to slap me on the wrist every time I said ChatGPT. Great. So I went through and I said, but it's just not as good. Like,
Mhm.
and they're like, yes, it is. You just need to go compare it. And what I realized here was that I was using Copilot for work for something that wasn't supposed to be used. That's not what it was intended to be used for.
Sure.
So I
Sure.
went through and I did some comparisons, and I actually did some side by side prompting of ChatGPT versus Copilot for web. It's almost identical in terms of the
Really?
responses.
That's
It's
awesome.
and so again, and look at me. I'm in a role where I'm very AI focused. I lead
Mhm.
the technology component of a technology consulting organization, and I was
Mhm.
doing it wrong. So if I can get it wrong, so can everybody else,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So we've got to make sure
Absolutely.
that we're addressing that human side of things.
Yeah.
But then the close cousin to that is the technical side of it, right? There are
Mhm.
technical prerequisites we want to put in place. So especially when we're working with our internal data, the quality of that data matters
Mhm.
quite a bit, right? So I
Sure.
think every organization of all sizes struggle with data governance,
Yes.
right? How do I make sure that my data is kept up to date, that I'm not keeping things longer than I need to, that I don't have
Mhm.
7 versions of the document, of which only one is the most recent and the good one, and that I'm not copying those in different places and different SharePoint sites and different team sites and all that kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
See,
Yeah.
Copilot doesn't know, which
Mhm.
is the challenge. Okay, and again,
Right.
especially in the small business SMB space, right?
Mhm.
It's even harder because they don't have the resources for some of the automations and things like that that can actually take some of that workload off of the business users who are
Mhm.
doing that. So making sure that we are intentional around where we're going to go through and point Copilot at for data. By default, it has access to everything, but maybe we start with a subset of our sites, right? That we take some
Yeah.
time to do some cleanup on, right? We really want to make sure that we're pointing Copilot at the best data in our organization, right?
Yeah, the example that I always like to give around this is if you look at my iPhotos on my iPhone, I have like 50 probably versions of one picture, that
Yeah.
we've taken like, really quickly and trying to just clean that up, right? Just do that. Go through it, delete the things you don't
Yeah.
need, get organized, right?
Yeah, that's no, and honestly, that's a great analogy, right? So if
Mm,
if I wanted Copilot to help me find a picture of a given
right.
topic, right? Which one do you want it to use? How does it know?
Right.
Right. And so
Exactly.
again, and don't get me wrong, the AIs are continuing to get better, and maybe you can
Sure.
ask for specific aspects of the picture to help it go through and pick that out for you.
Hmm.
But again, right, the more that as humans we take the time to go through and clean up our data before having AI interact with it, the better the results that we're going to get back from it.
Yeah.
And I may have to steal
Completely.
that
Yeah.
analogy, by that way.
Yeah. Oh, please, please do.
And I
I'll
don't, and
even
I'm,
give you my photos because there's a million of them. You won't. I always think about like I need to get this really organized, and I just yeah, it's bad.
yeah. Well, my challenge is the accidental screenshots that I take when I'm trying to go through and change the volume or something. And so I've probably got 100 different versions of the screen sitting in there as well. So it's
Yeah,
frankly embarrassing for someone to go look at.
Well, it's funny you say that because my husband, the big joke is that he must have it's a similar number of screenshots of his alarm when he's going to turn it on.
I have a number of those as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the security and the access controls. Like once you've got the data where it needs to be in a good position, like how do you manage access controls? Is it tied into some sort of access control within the Microsoft suite? Like how does all that work?
So this is super interesting because this ends up being one of the topics that are the most common that we have with customers. It's really, if you look
Really?
at what are they afraid of, is that
Hmm.
Copilot is going to give access to data that people shouldn't have,
Sure, like
right?
HR data or something like that, right?
Exactly,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
so the what's interesting here is that Copilot respects all of the security controls that you have in place. Right. So when
Okay.
Copilot interacts on your behalf, it has access to only the data that you have access to.
Okay.
Right. So if you are a member of a SharePoint site, if you're a member of a team, it has access to that data. Obviously, all of
Hmm.
your personal OneDrive, it has access to that as well in any
Sure.
files that people have shared with you. Right. So in the end, Copilot doesn't create a security problem that doesn't already exist. But, and
Right.
here's the but,
Oh,
okay, would someone think to just go do a random SharePoint search for the payroll file? Maybe, maybe not.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But could I ask Copilot, right? What does Sonal make?
Right.
Right. And it
Right.
has access to the information. It'll go get that answer for you.
Really?
Right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again,
Yeah.
but it's all based on what data you have access to. Right. So
Sure.
if you have a challenge with oversharing in your organization, so let's say if you go through and you think about Microsoft 365 sharing for a second, the
Hmm.
default scenario is I have to go through and pick the person I'm going to share with. Okay, so when I right
Yeah.
click and I choose share, right, then I have to go
Yeah.
select who it is. But there's an option there to share with the entire organization
Yeah.
or an option for everyone. What I've seen a lot of organizations do is that set the default to be shared with the whole organization,
Hmm.
right? And then
Yes.
they forget about it.
Right.
Okay. And so a
Yeah.
lot of times you end up with potentially sensitive content, right, that is shared with more people than it should. And again,
Mhm.
AI doesn't create this problem. The problem was already
Right.
there before, but now that people have this tool that does a much better job of searching and finding data in your organization, and
Hmm.
maybe they're just while they're playing with it, they're going to have to go test the limits. Now you have a problem.
Yes. Yeah. I was just going to say, it's interesting because from a security perspective, um, sitting down with different clients and talking through, explaining least privilege and going through the idea of, okay, well, who needs access to what is a really hard exercise for people, right?
It
Because
is.
there's a little bit of the, I don't want someone to feel bad that they don't have access to something. And I'm just like, forget about that. Don't worry about that. So I don't know if you've come across some of that in this type of journey as well.
Yeah, we definitely see some of that. Now,
Mhm.
obviously not with particular sensitive data, but again, going
Sure.
back to the
Yeah.
data governance side of things, people aren't always good at putting the data in the right place,
Yeah.
right? And that
Yeah.
becomes the challenge. And so
Yeah.
so we have a few things that Microsoft has tried to do to make it easier for organizations to kind of help in that space. So the first is they, let's say it was pretty close to the beginning of this year, Microsoft added licensing for SharePoint Advanced Management, okay, into
Hmm.
the Copilot for M365 license. So this
Okay.
previously was a $5 per user per month add-on, but it gives you access to a number of reports that let us go through and do things like identify where I have oversharing in
Oh,
place in my
wow.
organization.
Yeah.
And so it gives you like a pretty consolidated way to go through and see where I might have risk, okay, with that
Hmm.
oversharing of data in the organization. plus a number of tools to help us go through and make sure that we identify who are site owners. It gives you kind of a foundational way to go through and identify where I have risk in the organization, right? So I
Mm.
think that's huge.
Yeah.
If you're going to do Copilot adoption, that's a great way to go do it.
Yeah.
That also enables the ability to help us go through and kind of select which sites Copilot's going to have access to, right? So
Oh,
again, kind of
nice.
going back to what I said before, we don't maybe we don't want to turn it. It's going to take time to go through and
Mm-hmm.
do some of that data cleanup. So
Sure.
maybe I'm only going to
Mm-hmm.
point it at a handful of sites initially, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've got
Yeah.
that ability to kind of turn on and off right now,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
again we didn't have a year ago, to go through and give organizations a little bit more comfort, kind of rolling that out.
Right. Right. Right.
And then the other thing I would point out is that depending on your licensing, you may also have access to some of the purview features, okay, which are really
Okay.
focused around data security, data governance,
Mm-hmm.
compliance, that can help us identify sensitive information types. So maybe where
Mm.
I have personally identifiable information, health
Mm-hmm.
information, social security numbers, things like that, to identify and automatically label that data, right?
Oh,
Which
wow.
then we can
Mhm.
either exclude from Copilot or ensure that any Copilot produced content also inherits that label as well.
Interesting. Super cool. And is this, so do you have to put in parameters or does it automatically, like,
Yeah,
does it kind of know? Well, then you can,
it's going to depend on your licensing level. For I think most organizations in kind of the SMB space, we typically see business premium as kind of the
yes.
foundation
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
so it includes a lot of baseline security as part of that. In that scenario, you're going to have the ability to apply a sensitivity label manually, but you're not going to have that automation to go find it for you.
Got it. Okay.
Right.
Got
No,
it.
there
Yeah.
there are
Yeah. Yeah.
upgrade licenses that can obviously go through
Yes.
into that.
Yes. Very cool. Very cool. What about change management? I mean, you talked about the human, the human side of this whole implementation. Tell us a little bit about how that goes.
Yeah, I think so. So again, that's super important, right? Because we want to make sure that with this, one, we want to make sure that people understand and can use the tool effectively, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then second, we want to make sure that continues to be used on an ongoing basis, right? Because we
Yeah.
definitely see the scenario where people go through and they give them a license, they go try it a few times, they don't know how to use it, they don't get a good response as a result, and then they
Yeah.
stop using it. Right. So
Yeah.
we want to make sure that we're monitoring that over time, and there's dashboard stuff to help us go through and understand that built in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then on an ongoing basis, we want to make sure that we're then able as an organization. Why do I invest in an AI tool? Well, I
Right.
want to make my
Yeah.
people more productive. Well, why do I want to make them more productive? Because they can do more stuff. Okay, so if I take a task that someone now has an extra hour per day because they're using Copilot, well, what else are they going to do with that time? How do I repurpose that in a
Mm.
way to make my business more productive and more valuable? Right. So
Mm.
all of that is kind of tied into those change management conversations and
Yeah.
something that I mean, I know you do a lot of strategy advice for organizations,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
You got to be able to go through and define where does the ROI come from? And that
Yes.
ROI comes from that time that we have now freed up for those folks. But if I
Yeah.
don't have a strategy for then I to go do something productive with it, right? All I've done is well, I guess maybe I've made it a little less stress on those people. I mean, that's good.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah. And then there's the upskilling too, right? Because some organizations may have a generation or workforce that hasn't necessarily, dabbled with technology as much as perhaps the newer generation. And so, taking the time to get them comfortable to a point where they can actually leverage the technology and not sort of run from it too, right?
change is hard. It is easy to
Yeah.
go through and fall back into habits. That
Yes. Oh
they're
yeah.
well worn. I mean, we've got muscle memory. We've done the same thing for forever and ever. I mean, just
Mhm.
look at one of the things that's interesting here is, Microsoft rolls out, updates to applications. Changing the interface a little bit can set people back from a productivity standpoint for weeks. Okay. And again, it's just because we have those well-worn patterns in our memory. And so,
Mhm.
getting people to go through and say, hey, I'm going to go try to do it a new way, it takes intention and it takes focus. Generally, it takes someone either in your organization or outside of the organization to take that on as a responsibility and to make
Yes.
sure that you are driving it forward.
Yeah, I could, yes, you said it amazingly. Yes, because that comes up a lot in terms of, how do we get the people like I had a conversation with some CEOs and they had mentioned that they were really excited to embrace AI and And through the conversation, they were like, you know what? We're the only ones that have actually had this conversation, and we think it's a great idea, but we haven't even talked to our employees about it. And so the first step that we did was we actually polled people internally to understand what their appetite was, where, what the learning curve was like. And instead of diving into an implementation, we just sort of started with some education about what AI was. And doing those, stopping and recognizing that, I think will tremendously help make your implementation go much smoother than not.
No, I think that's super important, right? So going back to the strategy piece there for a minute,
Mhm.
I think there's the what tools are we going to put in place? What are we trying to accomplish? But what's interesting here is we find is that we go in and we're starting to help organizations with the adoption of Copilot. And
Yeah.
again, you've got some folks that are super excited about it, right? And their wheels
Mhm.
start spinning about all these different ideas, right? Then you got others that are like, I don't want to put the time into this. I'm too busy to go through and
Right.
adopt this stuff,
Yeah.
right? But generally, what seems to happen is you start to get people engaged on it. They start seeing the possibility space, and then they start iterating on ideas. Well, can
Yeah.
we do this? Can it do this? Right? And a lot of times the answer is going to be no, it actually can't. Right.
Yes.
So I mean,
Yeah.
again, it does some things really well. It helps us generate content. It helps us go through and answer questions and understand things more effectively. It helps us go through and create, graphics and things like that. But it's not going to help me always go through and say automate a business process,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, but again, but if we go back to kind of our business user, right, they're not thinking about the technology, right? They're
Yeah.
thinking about how can I solve this business problem? How can I make this thing go faster? How can I make it have less errors? How can I make it more efficient? But Copilot and AI in general drives a lot of conversations around where we can apply digital transformation more broadly.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the answer is Copilot. Sometimes the answer is a Copilot agent, which can
Yes.
run somewhat autonomously, right? So we can
Mhm.
set up an agent for a particular purpose, and it can
Mhm.
go through and perform tasks on our behalf. Sometimes it goes back to more basic business process automation, right? Can
Right.
we use a tool like a Power Automate, okay, to move data from here to there, or to extract information from a document and go put it in another location,
Yeah.
right? And again,
Yeah.
all of those things exist, right? And
Mhm.
so you think about yeah, every organization. Let's take accounts payable for a minute.
Right. Right.
Right. So I get an invoice from, vendor that I'm working with, whatever it is. Okay. And I've got to go through and take that invoice and I now have to enter that in, either an accounting system or an ERP system. Okay. And so typically you have a human who is looking at the document. They're pulling the information out and they're doing data entry in the system.
Mhm.
Okay. So again, this is AI, maybe not generative AI like a
Right.
Copilot, right? But there's AI tools that can take that semi-structured data, because again, invoices are going to they're going to have similar fields, but they're
Yes.
not going to be the same from every vendor to vendor,
Right.
right? They're going to have their own versions. But there's
Yeah.
tools that can go through, extract the information from that semi-structured data, pull out the invoice number, pull out the vendor name, pull out the amounts, okay, and can then take
Mhm.
that data and we can push it into a particular system. So that's
Mhm.
an automatable process, but most organizations don't know that that exists. But then you start
Yes.
talking to them about Copilot, and they're like, "Well, can it do this?" Like, well, no, but right, we
Yeah.
can go through and use. In that case, it would be with Microsoft's version of it with the Power Platform, Power Automate, and SharePoint Syntax can do that document extraction,
Yeah.
okay, in a
Mhm.
automated way. So it's really cool because you start getting into these scenarios where it really wasn't Copilot, but the fact that we've started driving this adoption has unlocked other possibilities for the business,
Oh,
which is really
absolutely, right? Like, really just brainstorming and having those discovery sessions, if you will, right? To talk about the possibilities because you don't know what you don't know. And that's why people like you and I exist, so that we could actually help in that journey and bring those ideas to life, right?
no doubt about it.
Yeah, and so you mentioned, prompting and getting really good at prompting in the training piece and, any more to add in that space?
Yeah, I think again, it's all somewhat related here, right?
Mhm,
But what
yeah,
we try to help organizations ultimately go through and do, and so I mentioned before that it helps to have someone who is leading this, whether it's
yeah,
inside the organization or out, but someone whose job it is to make sure that we're moving forward with it. But ultimately, what we try to coach customers to do is to build a community of practice,
yeah,
right? So we want to get people that can be champions for this within the organization. And so a lot of times that starts with having a team inside of Microsoft Teams that's
mhm,
dedicated for AI adoption, right? That's where we go through and we publish some of our usage data, right? But we want people to interact in there and be able to share their particular use cases. right? We can actually go through and take some of that information. Microsoft has prompt libraries that you can use that Microsoft has kind of captured over time. We
Mm-hmm.
typically add some of that stuff for our customers based on some of the things we've seen, right? But you can
Mm-hmm.
actually share that internally as well. If you have a prompt that works well for you, we want to make
Yeah.
sure that you're sharing that with other people in the organization, right?
Yeah.
And so taking that time to go through and try to drive that kind of self-reinforcing community of practice, right? But that also gets other people to have just more literacy kind of within the AI space, right? It
Yeah.
helps them go through and start to understand some of the possibilities. And then again, that's where you start really seeing the value, because then you start finding other use cases across the business that you can then go through and really kind of drive the value and the ROI on the investment.
Absolutely. And I love the idea of this internal or, external prompt library. I mean, there's so many online, right, that you can just pull from
Yeah.
too. But really that's this knowledge base that you're creating internally, and to be able to leverage that to do searches, to create things, it's just, I think, such a valuable asset to build internally.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. What we really don't want is for the data to become siloed, right?
Yeah,
So we're doing our best to
exactly.
just
Yeah.
not see that more broad adoption across the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was the licensing piece and the technical side. Now, this is a piece I will admit that always confuses me. So please enlighten us here.
Oh my goodness. I have a love-hate relationship with Microsoft licensing.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, I mean, it's I think Microsoft has an incredible value proposition, right, that they
Mhm.
bring to market with Microsoft 365 and the various services that are part of that, especially in the SMB space. The business plans, business standard, business premium, which
Mhm.
are available for up to 300 users on a given tenant, are absolutely incredible value for the prices.
Yeah. Yeah.
Business premium, for example, includes a lot of foundational security. It's $22 a user a month. And
Yeah.
if you try to compare building a stack of technologies with something that is non-Microsoft, you're going to pay a lot more for it,
Sure.
right? But it is complex, right? The
Yeah.
downside of this and Microsoft bringing so much technology into these bundles that they have is that there's a lot of complexity in terms of trying to figure that stuff out. Now,
Yeah.
we've built a business off of helping customers go through and navigate that. I like to think of it like a few things, right? So first is I'm typically going to want to have my foundational productivity tools, so my email, my personal document storage in OneDrive, Teams, SharePoint, that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
right? I want to have that solid foundation. For most organizations, that's going to be business standard or business premium. That's going to provide
Mhm.
that. If you're larger, you're looking at some of that E plans like Microsoft
Mhm.
365 E3, right? And that becomes kind of that foundational layer, right, to store the data on M365.
Yeah.
Second thing is I want to start to look at my security posture, right? And
Mhm.
again, typically things like multi-factor authentication, our device management is we want to have built into that. And so again, that would be business premium or E3, again, as well.
Mhm.
Typically those are included. Those are both going to make sure that we have the installable versions of the Office apps, right? So again, from
Mhm.
a Copilot standpoint, I want to make sure that I can use it inside of Outlook, Teams,
Sure.
Word, Excel, etc. So we have that. And then I need to build Copilot on top of that, right? So that's
Yeah.
a $30 a user a month, which I've had some organizations go through and say, well, with business premium is 22, how is Microsoft going to charge me $30 per user per month for Copilot?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's only about 70 cents per business hour worked. Okay.
Yeah.
And in the
Right.
end, the licensing may feel it's expensive, but you know what's expensive? People.
Yes.
Right. And
Yes.
so if I can make
Absolutely.
somebody who, I'll just throw out a number here. So let's say they make $80,000 in a marketing role. I
Mhm.
can make them 10% more productive. Okay. It,
Right.
it is a no-brainer use case to go through and
Absolutely.
deploy Copilot for the organization. Right.
100%.
And then if you're in a regulated industry, I mentioned some of the purview tools earlier that are
Right.
really
Right.
got to have more some of the more automated data governance, data security, and things like that. So there
Mhm.
are options to go through and add that on. Not every organization is going to go through and need that, especially in the
Mhm.
SMB space. But as we see, a lot more organizations have to deal with CMMC, other regulatory requirements to go through and have an enhanced level of security. There's definitely options to go through and consider in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, I know you guys have a really great resource on your website, which I'll link to in the show notes, that kind of talks about all the different licensing. So I've studied that, and truth be told, I've stolen it from you guys as
More
well.
than welcome. We try to, it's not designed to go through and give you every single
Right,
detail about it, but it's
right.
going to give you all of the things that organizations use to make a decision. And we try to
Yes.
summarize it in a way that we hope is consumable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the use cases that you guys see through your implementations. And, what are some of the things that are most common that you see people leveraging, a Copilot for? What are some of those workflows or tasks that you're seeing, being leveraged?
Well, I'll tell you, I think my personal favorite, okay, is the intelligent recap feature inside of Teams meetings.
Okay.
So if I record or transcribe a Teams meeting, right,
Uh-huh.
Copilot is going to automatically go through and summarize both the notes, right, from the meeting, things that we talked about, help us identify any action items, and can even then go through and create planner tasks automatically to make sure that we're tracking those moving forward.
Right.
So
Right.
what I found for me personally is that I don't take notes inside of meetings anymore. I used to have a
Right.
OneNote up, and so while I'm trying to go through and interact with the person I'm on the call with, I'm also trying to go through and take my personal notes on it, and so it's let me be more present inside of meetings,
Yes.
right? Which is
Yes. Yeah.
super helpful. Um, and
Absolutely.
and a great example of this, I was with a customer. We were on site in Nashville to go through and visit with them. We had
Mhm.
it was about an hour and a half kind of envisioning session. We were talking through kind of where they're at with adoption of technologies. We went through a lot of different areas around potential things that they could do to go through and enhance their environment. So
Mhm.
even though everybody who was participating in the meeting was in the room, right, we still joined the teams, added
Yeah.
Copilot, and so when we got done, I had a nice summary of the things that we talked about that I could share back to the customer. So all of us could be very, again, present in the meeting.
Yeah.
But then I also had the ability to use Copilot to interact with the recording afterwards. So
Oh,
I asked it to summarize a list of projects, okay,
yeah.
that we had talked about, and then
Yeah.
create a first pass at the bullet points for implementation.
Oh, nice.
Okay,
Love
so
it.
it probably saved me in terms of the follow-up for a customer. I mean, we do those types of envisioning sessions. Probably would have taken me a couple of hours to tie all of that stuff together and summarize back to them. 10
Oh,
minutes.
yeah.
10
Oh my
minutes and a couple of
goodness.
prompts. I mean, huge, huge time saver.
So all you project managers who are listening, I mean, take note.
Oh, completely.
Right.
That was in our organization. It was our project management team that were some of the first that we actually put those licenses on.
Yeah.
Okay. Huge value to project managers. If you are spending
Right.
a lot of time in meetings, it is life changing. And
Yes.
I'm not exaggerating. It is life
I
changing.
I can imagine. Yes. I used to be heavily in those roles, and you're just going back to back to back, and then you're burning the midnight oil to just sort of put it all together, and you just don't need to do that anymore.
Yeah. And then another one that I'll kind of toss out here is really focused around kind of personal productivity. And
Mhm.
so I think everybody suffers with email, right? And in terms
Mhm.
of that, it's hard to keep up on. I mean, especially if you're in a lot of meetings, you have emails come in as part of that. You're doing your best to try to keep up on it. Maybe we're
Mhm.
multitasking when we shouldn't. Right. But Copilot at the end of the day, to be able to go through and ask Copilot in Outlook, okay, go through, look through my emails, identify anything that I didn't respond to,
Mhm.
okay, and create a draft response for me or put it on a list of, my to-do list to go through and start tomorrow. But
Yeah.
essentially to summarize where I've potentially have gaps, things that I still need to get to and help keep me organized. We've
Mhm.
got, and I'll actually share this back to you, so maybe you can kind of share it as part of the recording. But
Sure.
we try
Yeah.
to have an Uber prompt, as we call it, to go
Oh.
through and kind of have that end of the day, okay, wrap up and prepare for the next day. And
Oh
again,
my
this is something
goodness.
that I think is across the board for everybody who can use this.
That's amazing. Yes, I have to get my hands on that, and I'd love to share it out 'cause that just not only helps you feel like you've closed the day out,
Yeah.
but then you've also prepped for your morning, right? I mean,
Mhm.
we all know what mornings are like.
Yep.
That's amazing. That's awesome. I love those 2 examples. Um, and so, as we kind of try to start thinking about wrapping this up, I'm thinking about the SMB, right? And they're listening to us talking about this and all this technology. Where do we start as an SMB? I'm like, I'm listening to this and I'm excited, but I still don't know where to start. So what's your advice there?
Yeah, I would go through and say, so if you're already using Microsoft 365, Copilot, I think is the best place to start from an AI standpoint.
Yeah.
right? It's within my security boundaries, right? It's relatively, I mean, it's a little bit more expensive than again like a ChatGPT Enterprise,
Mhm.
but again, I can kind of do it pretty easily as an add-on to my existing licensing, and I don't have
Mhm.
to go through and apply it to everybody in the organization,
Yeah.
right? So we can go
Yeah.
through and pick. Obviously, executives are a great place to start. Project managers are a great place to start.
Mm.
Sales and marketing, right, can
Yeah.
benefit from it pretty frequently. Yeah, but pick those people within the organization and let's go through and just get it going. Like I
Yeah.
said before, it's not going to create security problems that don't already exist, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
maybe you do a little bit of, like I said, the SharePoint Advanced Management, look at those reports, whether it's, if you have internal IT or you have a vendor that you work with, ask them to go look at that, and then go through and just start playing with it. Right.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you have an organization, like if you can come in to help or someone like us could come in to help, obviously
Yeah.
that's better. But I wouldn't say you have to wait for that. Right. I think
Yes.
the number
Yeah.
one thing is just to get moving with it, to try
Mhm.
things and try to encourage that culture of let's go play with it. Let's see if we can break
Yeah.
it. Let's see if we can do interesting things and push the limits. And you'll pretty rapidly start to figure out, well, what works and what doesn't. Okay.
Mhm.
And then you can start to figure out where your next steps come from, right?
Yeah.
Do I want to look at some of these purpose built AI tools for a given job, right? Or, is Copilot ultimately kind of what we need?
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Well, some takeaways here. So I always like to ask my guests to, give me some takeaways that people can who are listening or watching can walk away with from this discussion. So I'm putting you on the hot seat, Mike. Why don't you give us a few?
Well, part of what's driven the adoption of the AI tools is a little bit of FOMO, that fear of missing out,
Yeah.
right? And so, and there's truth to this, right? So if you're not doing AI, there is a very, very, very good chance that your competitors are.
Yeah.
Right. I read a super interesting article, it's a couple years ago at this point from the Harvard Business Review, and it was talking about algorithms as a competitive differentiation. So they were talking about
Mhm.
Amazon in particular, and how much of their value in an organization, okay, was basically on the technology foundation on which the organization is built, how they have codified business processes
Mhm.
inside their software that they have built as part of that.
Mhm.
Enormous competitive advantages built up into that. Right. And so AI is the ability to go through and ultimately do a lot of those things today. Right. If you're not
Mhm.
putting AI in place now, your competitors are, and that is an immediate competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
so I think
Yeah,
it's just I wouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Right. If you can get
absolutely.
started with
Yeah.
this, go get started on it right away. The security is important, but you can catch up on that if you have to.
Yeah, and if you follow Ethan Mollick's, co-intelligence and just everything he writes, he always talks about how AI is the great equalizer, right? And
Yes.
it's really going to change our workforce, but if you're not taking advantage of any of it, trust me, your competitors definitely are. And if you don't have a strategy internally, your employees are using it on their phones. Everyone's using it. So, why not just bring it to the forefront and just take advantage of it?
I think it's super important to give them an outlet that is approved, right? Because
Yeah.
otherwise they're going to go through and they're going to be using tools and you don't know what's there. And
Yeah.
you're not, no one's in a scenario where they can put the genie back in the bottle. It's not going to happen at this point. So let's go
Yes.
through and say, hey, we have all this energy, we have all this excitement. Let's direct it in a place that is approved, right? That we have the ability to
Mhm.
monitor, that makes it easy to secure, right? That
Yeah.
we can be comfortable that we're using AI responsibly in our organizations.
Absolutely. And the one thing that just kind of popped to my mind is if I had to choose between an organization that was embracing these new technologies versus someone that was running from them, I think I would want to be with the one that was more up and coming and willing to explore and experiment. Just
Yeah,
my take.
well, I think that's spot on. So and
Right.
from an HR perspective, if you're out there recruiting,
Yeah.
do you want to not be do you want to be that company that's not using AI, right?
Yeah.
Trying to recruit,
Yeah.
especially if you look at today's college students. I mean, I know we've got a bit of a challenge kind of in the university space right now
Yeah.
around how
Yeah.
often they're using the AI tools to go through and complete assignments and things like that. And I will admit that I've got a bit of mixed opinion on this one. right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
uh,
Yeah, I'm with you.
I hear a lot of the same things around AI that I heard about calculators when I was in high school,
Yeah.
right? And I still learned how to do math, okay, even if the
Yes.
calculator helps make me more effective,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so you're taking this generation now that are essentially being raised on AI. You don't want to bring them an organization where that doesn't have access to those tools.
Yeah, 100%. Well, on that note, Mike, thank you so much for being a guest here and sharing your insights. And I just can't wait to have you back and talk a little bit more about, well, probably take another angle of AI and just dive deeper. But I'd love for you to tell our guests how they can find you, LinkedIn, website, wherever.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll do this again at some point because the pace of change is just absolutely
I
insane.
know, right?
But thank you so much for having me. It's Mike Wilson, Interlink Cloud Advisors, so interlink.com is the best way to get a hold of us. And if you're looking for any follow up with me specifically, hello@interlink.com is the easy button to, if you got a question about Microsoft licensing, how to move forward with the stuff, happy to go through and help connect you with the right resource in the organization.
Yeah, and I'll link all of this in the show notes. And I have to say that I actually recently met Mike at a conference where he gave a talk about their journey with AI. And it was amazing that when he got off stage, I had to go run up to him and tell him how much I enjoyed his presentation and wanted to get him on the show. And, we've connected since then. And I've just really enjoyed this journey and this friendship. So thank you so much, Mike,
Likewise.
for being on the show and for just imparting all of your knowledge. It's been so great. So thank you so much. And again, we'll have you back and we'll talk about more details around AI. I wanted to remind our guests here that if you are interested in contacting Minerva to do strategy work or any sort of security work, you can contact us. Yeah, exactly. At Let's Talk at minervaconsultinginc.com. You can also go to our website at minervaconsultinginc.com. And as usual, I like to ask our listeners to take 3 quick next steps: subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating, and add a comment. Thank you again, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining on this video podcast. So thanks so much. And we'll see you guys next time.